This year, the brightest house on the block isn't a celebration, it's a trap. And the man in the red suit isn't here to leave gifts. He's here to staple you to the scenery. The heavy snowfall of December 2025 didn't feel magical to Sarah. It felt like a burial. Living in a remote farmhouse 3 miles outside of Oak Haven, Vermont, she was used to the isolation, but this year was different. The air was thick with the hype of the Silent Night remake, a movie that had turned every lawn ornament in America into a source of paranoia. The creeper trend had taken over social media, with people posting doorbell camera footage of a silent, red-suited figure standing perfectly still in the tree line. Sarah had laughed it off. She was 24, a freelance graphic designer who valued her solitude. But as she stood in her kitchen on Christmas Eve, the silence of the rural landscape felt heavy, almost pressurized. Her nearest neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Henderson, hadn't turned on his porch lights in 2 days. The horror hook didn't start with a scream. It started with a hum, a low electrical buzz that vibrated in her teeth. Sarah looked out the kitchen window. Her own backyard was a festive display of high voltage, LED icicles, and inflatable reindeer decorations her ex-boyfriend had insisted on installing before they split. Suddenly the lights flickered. They didn't just dim. They pulsed in a rhythmic, heartbeat-like pattern. Red, white, red, white. And there, standing exactly where the vegetable garden should be, was the Santa. He wasn't moving. He was wearing a deep blood crimson suit that looked damp despite the freezing temperature. His face was obscured by a mask that looked less like plastic and more like cured pale leather. He didn't carry a sack of toys. He held a long industrial-grade coil of heavy-duty extension cords. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed her phone to call the police, but the screen was dead. She plugged it into the wall charger, nothing. The power in the house was still on, but the cellular signal was non-existent. She ran to the front door and threw the bolt, but as she reached for the handle, she heard a sickening snap hiss. Blue sparks flew past the window. She watched in paralyzed horror as the string of LED lights draped along her porch began to move. They weren't falling, they were being pulled. Someone or something was outside wrapping the house. She sprinted to the back door, but it was already too late. Through the glass, she saw the Santa figure standing just inches away. He wasn't trying to break in. He was methodically weaving thick, reinforced light strands across the door frame, stapling them into the heavy oak with a pneumatic gun that hissed like a viper. "Hey!" Sarah screamed, pounding on the glass. "I'm calling the cops! Get away from my house!" The Santa stopped. He tilted his head, the leathery mask crinkling. Then, he raised a hand wrapped in a black tactical glove and pointed toward the transformer on the utility pole at the edge of her property. With a sharp tug of a wire he had already rigged, the transformer exploded in a shower of white-hot sparks. The house plunged into darkness, but only for a second. Suddenly, the exterior decorations flared to life with an unnatural, blinding intensity. He had rigged her festive display to a portable industrial generator. The LEDs weren't just glowing. They were whining, overcharged to the point of smoke. The house was being shrink-wrapped in a cage of burning hot wire and blinding light. Sarah ran to the living room window, hoping to smash the glass and leap out. But the Santa had been busy. A massive, inflatable Santa's workshop had been shoved against the window from the outside and inflated with such force that it acted like a high-pressure airbag, sealing the exit. The heat was rising. The overcharged LED strands wrapped around the wooden window frames were beginning to char the wood. The smell of burning pine and melting plastic began to seep through the vents. Please, Sarah shrieked, her voice breaking. She heard a sound from the roof. Thump, thump. He was coming down the chimney. It was a cliché from a nightmare, but Sarah knew the reality was worse. Her fireplace was a modern gas insert with a glass front, but the flue was still wide enough for a determined man. She scrambled to the kitchen and grabbed a butcher knife, her hands slick with cold sweat. The smell of ozone was thick now. The house began to glow a sickly flickering red as the thousands of overcharged bulbs outside began to melt the vinyl siding. A heavy boot shattered the glass of the gas insert. The scent had tumbled into the living room, trailing a tangle of silver tinsel that looked like barbed wire. He stood up slowly. He was massive, his presence sucking the air out of the room. He didn't say a word. He reached into his belt and pulled out a heavy-duty staple gun and a length of wire that ended in a frayed, sparking copper tip. "Why?" Sarah whispered, backing into the kitchen. The man reached up and slowly peeled back the leather mask. Behind it wasn't a monster, but a man with hollowed-out, grieving eyes, a face that looked like it had been scrubbed of all humanity. "You have so many lights, Sarah," he rasped. His voice sounded like grinding stones. "But you never saw the dark coming, did you?" He lunged. Sarah swung the knife, catching him in the shoulder, but he didn't even flinch. He grabbed her wrist with a strength that felt like a vice. He didn't stab her. Instead, he forced her back against the kitchen island. He took the sparking copper wire and held it inches from her face. Outside, the house was a funeral pyre of Christmas cheer. The heat was unbearable now, the walls beginning to blister. "Decoration," he whispered. "That's all people are." With a sudden violent movement, he didn't kill her. He grabbed her hand and stapled a strand of glowing red lights directly into the wooden island, pinning her sleeve and the skin of her forearm to the counter. Sarah's scream was lost in the roar of the fire starting in the walls. He began to decorate the kitchen, weaving lights through the handles of the drawers, over the chairs, and finally around Sarah herself. He was turning her into part of the display. As the smoke grew thick, the man walked toward the back door, which was now melting off its hinges. He turned back one last time. The overcharged lights reflected in his dead eyes, making them look like glowing coals. "Merry Christmas, Sarah," he said softly. "Everyone's going to see you tonight." He stepped out into the snow, disappearing into the white void. Sarah, pinned to her own kitchen by the very lights she had used to celebrate, watched as the red and white glow grew brighter and brighter until the heat finally took the oxygen from the room. The next morning, the Oakhaven Fire Department found the farmhouse. It was a blackened skeleton, but one thing remained. The industrial generator in the yard was still humming. Because of the way the killer had rigged the wires, the charred remains of the kitchen island and the figure draped across it were still illuminated by a single flickering strand of unburnt LEDs. From the road, it looked like a beautiful glowing star in the middle of a graveyard of snow. The creeper trend didn't die that Christmas. It only got faster. Because that night, 3 other people in rural Vermont reported seeing a silent Santa standing in their yards, holding a staple gun and a coil of wire, waiting for the lights to go out. The year walk doesn't tell you how to live. It forces you to practice dying until your heart finally agrees to stop. In the remote, snow-locked wilderness of the Adirondack Mountains, the year 2025 was bleeding out under a moon that looked like a cold, unblinking eye. For Maya, a disgraced investigative journalist seeking a spiritual reset, the ancient Swedish tradition of cursing the year walk wasn't just a folklore curiosity. It was a desperate attempt to find out if there was any future left for her at all. The rules were simple, yet psychologically brutal. To successfully walk, one had to remain in total darkness and absolute silence for 24 hours on Christmas Eve. No food, no water, no contact with the living. At the stroke of midnight, you would emerge and walk through the woods toward the oldest churchyard in the county. If you survived the spirits of the forest, the glimpse of the future would be yours. The horror hook of Maya's night didn't start with a ghost. It started with the shattering of the silence. Exactly 1 hour before midnight, as Maya sat in the pitch-black basement of her rented cabin, her throat aching from disuse, a sound echoed from the floorboards above. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of her own voice, crisp, clear, and laughing coming from the kitchen. "I'm already dead, Maya," the voice whispered through the floor vents. "Why are you still waiting?" Maya bit her tongue until she tasted copper. She knew the legend. The forest would try to make you speak. If you broke the silence before the walk was done, you didn't just lose the future, you became part of the forest's past. The midnight threshold, when the grandfather clock upstairs chimed 12 times, Maya stood. Her legs were weak, her mind a fraying rope of hallucinations. She stepped out into the Adirondack night. The cold was a physical weight, dropping the temperature to a lethal $10 circ F dollar. The woods felt different. The trees didn't look like pines anymore. They looked like long skeletal fingers reaching out of the permafrost. As she trudged through the knee-deep snow toward the St. Jude's Cemetery, the silence of the woods became deafening. Then she saw it. Standing in the middle of a frozen creek was the brook horse. It wasn't a horse made of flesh, but of black rushing water that defied the freezing temperatures. It stood 7 feet tall, its eyes glowing with a bioluminescent rot. It didn't gallop, it flowed. Maya kept her head down. "Don't look at it. Don't speak to it." The horse let out a sound like a drowning man's last gasp and lunged. It didn't bite her. It passed through her. For a second, Maya felt her lungs fill with icy, stagnant pond water. She buckled, a scream rising in her throat, but she swallowed it, choking on the phantom liquid. The horse vanished into the mist, leaving behind the scent of old, wet coins. The churchyard gate. By the time the iron gates of St. Jude's appeared through the trees, Maya's toes were numb and her vision was tunneling. The cemetery was a jagged collection of slate headstones from the 1800s, half buried in drifts of white. To complete the year walk, she had to blow through the keyhole of the church door. This act would grant her the vision. As she stepped onto the consecrated ground, the sky turned a bruised, sickly purple. The night raven, a massive, shadow entity with wings that sounded like sharpening knives, circled overhead. It began to drop feathers that weren't feathers at all, but shards of black glass that hissed as they hit the snow. Maya reached the heavy oak door of the church. Her hands were gray with frostbite. She leaned in, her lips touching the frozen iron of the keyhole. She blew a single shaky breath into the void of the lock. The world didn't show her the next year's headlines. It didn't show her a new job or a new life. The world tilted. The snow turned to ash. The vision of the end suddenly, Maya wasn't at the church anymore. She was back in her cabin. It was warm. The fire was roaring. She felt a sense of immense relief. "I made it," she thought. "I'm home." She walked to the bathroom to splash warm water on her face. She looked in the mirror, but she didn't see her reflection. She saw the back of her own head. In the mirror, she watched herself. The future Maya reached for a bottle of pills on the counter. She watched herself swallow them one by one with a calm, terrifying efficiency. Then, she watched herself lie down in the empty bathtub. The year walk wasn't showing her a path to avoid. It was showing her the last thing she would ever see. Maya tried to scream, but the silence of the walk had become permanent. Her vocal cords felt as though they had been replaced by dry straw. She looked down at her hands in the vision, and they were the hands of a corpse, blue and bloated. Then the loop reset. She was back at the bathroom door. She watched herself reach for the pills. She was back at the bathroom door. She watched herself swallow. She was back at the bathroom door. Each time the loop restarted, the present Maya felt her actual heart rate the future Maya in the tub. She realized with a jolt of pure crystalline horror that the year walk hadn't predicted her death, it was enacting it. The spirits of 2025 didn't want to warn her. They wanted to feed on the inevitability of her end. The frozen morning when the sun finally crested the Adirondack Peaks at 7:14 a.m., the local sheriff found a figure slumped against the door of St. Jude's Church. It was Maya. She was frozen solid, her lips still pressed against the iron keyhole as if she were trying to whisper a secret to the dead. The strange thing, the thing the sheriff couldn't stop talking about at the diner later, was her face. Most people who freeze to death have a look of weary sleepiness. Maya's face was a mask of wide-eyed absolute paralysis. Her pupils were blown wide and etched into the frost on the church door. Right where her eyes had been staring were hundreds of tiny scratched-in tallies. As the sun hit her eyes, the ice in her tear ducts melted, making it look like she was finally crying. The year walk of 2025 claimed 12 victims across the country that night. Each one was found in a state of perceptual lock, their bodies dead, but their brains showing activity levels consistent with a person experiencing a high-stress event. They weren't just dead, they were still in the loop. They were still watching the last thing they would ever see over and over, while the world moved on into a 2026 they would never touch. In 2025, cleaning your room isn't just a chore, it's a survival tactic, because Frau Perchta doesn't care about your followers. She only cares about what she can replace your heart with. In the deep, frozen creases of northern Montana, where the wind screams through the pines like a dying animal, sits an isolated glass and steel cabin. This was the headquarters of Chloe Vane, a lifestyle influencer with 4 million followers and a soul made of tempered glass. Chloe didn't do cozy, she did aesthetic. By late December 2025, the internet had moved past the playful terror of Krampus. The new viral obsession was #the bellies LITTR-Frau Perchta. The ancient alpine deity was trending globally, a dual-faced goddess who rewarded the industrious and eviscerated the lazy. According to the legend, by the 12th night of Christmas, all work must be finished, and every room must be pristine. If not, Perchta would come with her silver blade, unzip your torso, and replace your organs with straw and stones. Chloe found the trend hilarious. On her January 5th livestream, she sat amidst a chaotic wreckage of designer shopping bags, half-eaten catering trays, and piles of unwashed laundry. Rules are for people without a following, babes. Chloe laughed into her ring light, sipping a martini. The only work I have left is finishing this drink. If Frau Perchta wants to find me, she better bring a camera crew. She ended the stream to a chorus of "Rip Chloe" and "Do Untempt Her" comments. She tossed her phone onto a pile of discarded cashmere and climbed into her king-sized bed, leaving the rest of the house in a state of expensive filth. The sound of the loon Chloe woke at 3:11 a.m. to a sound that shouldn't exist in a high-tech Montana cabin. It was a rhythmic thump-clack, thump-clack, the sound of an ancient wooden loom. The air in the bedroom had turned impossibly cold. Her breath didn't just mist. It fell as tiny ice crystals onto her silk sheets. She reached for her phone, but the screen was cracked across the center. The battery drained to zero. Thump clack, thump clack. It was coming from the kitchen. Chloe grabbed a heavy brass candle snuffer, the closest thing she had to a weapon, and crept out of the bedroom. The floorboards, usually warm from the radiant heating, felt like slabs of dry ice. As she turned the corner into the open concept living area, she stopped. The mess she had left was gone. The shopping bags were folded, the laundry was stacked, but it hadn't been cleaned by a maid. The clothes were shredded, woven into a grotesque towering tapestry that hung from the ceiling. Sitting in the center of the room was a figure draped in a heavy moth-eaten wool cloak. The figure was too tall and possessed two faces. One, facing the window, was a beautiful porcelain-skinned woman with hair like spun silver. The other face, directed toward Chloe, was a withered gray mask of rot with a jaw that hung open to reveal jagged, iron-stained teeth. This was the Began, the ugly version of the goddess. "The work is not finished," the creature whispered. The voice sounded like dry corn husks rubbing together. The heart is still full of pride. The stomach is still full of greed. The silver knife. Chloe tried to run, but her feet felt heavy, as if her boots were filled with lead. The creature didn't move fast. It glided, the sound of silver scraping against the slate floor echoing in the hollow room. In its long, spindly fingers, it held a curved knife. The blade didn't reflect the moonlight. It seemed to drink it. "I have money," Chloe shrieked, backing into the glass wall of the balcony. "I'll pay. I'll hire a crew. I'll clean everything." The beautiful face of the goddess turned slowly toward Chloe, though the body remained facing the other way. "Money is just paper for the fire," the beautiful face said with a haunting melodic cruelty. "Perchta only accepts the labor of the soul." "You have been idle, Chloe Vin. You have let the weeds grow in your spirit." The ugly face let out a wet, guttural hiss. With a movement swifter than a strike of lightning, the creature was upon her. Chloe felt a coldness sharper than the Montana winter press against her sternum. The silver knife entered her skin with a sickening, effortless zip. Chloe didn't feel pain at first, only an immense, hollow cold. She looked down, her eyes wide with a terror that transcended physical agony. The goddess was methodically, almost surgically, opening her from her collarbone to her hip. "Too much glitter," Perchta rasped, reaching into the incision with hands that felt like frozen rakes. "Too much noise. We must make you useful. We must make you solid." Chloe watched in a delirium of shock as the creature began to pull. Her intestines, slick and pink, were tossed onto the designer rug like discarded ribbons. Her liver, her kidneys, everything that made her biological, everything that felt, was removed with the practiced ease of a butcher. The feeling, the pain finally arrived, a white-hot explosion that made Chloe's vision fracture. She tried to scream, but her lungs were being handled, disconnected, and cast aside. "Now," the goddess whispered, "the filling." From the folds of her ancient cloak, Perchta pulled handfuls of dry yellow straw and jagged gray river stones. She began to stuff them into Chloe's empty chest cavity. The straw poked through the edges of the wound, and the stones settled heavily against her spine with dull, thudding sounds. "Heavier now," the beautiful face smiled. "Now you will stay where you are put. No more floating on the wind of the world's praise." The goddess took a needle made of a human rib and a thread of black sinew. She began to sew. Each stitch was a jagged, ugly crosshatch. She didn't care about the aesthetic. She cared about the seal. As the final knot was tied, the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of violent orange. The 12th night display. When Chloe's assistant arrived at 9 a.m. to prep for a sponsored shoot, the cabin was silent. The door was unlocked. The assistant found Chloe in the living room. She was sitting perfectly upright in her expensive velvet chair, facing the window. The house was immaculate, not a speck of dust remained. "Chloe?" The assistant whispered. Chloe didn't turn. She couldn't. She was rigid, her skin pulled tight over a frame that seemed strangely lumpy and heavy. Her eyes were open, staring at the mountains, but they were no longer blue. They had been replaced by two smooth gray river pebbles. A single piece of straw poked out from the corner of her mouth. The assistant screamed and ran, but as she reached the door, she tripped over something. Looking down, she saw a pile of discarded, bloody organs neatly arranged in the shape of a Christmas tree in the center of the hallway. At the very top of the pile, pinned with a silver needle, was a note written on a piece of Chloe's own parchment. "The work is finally done." The 2025 Christmas season ended that day in Montana, but the legend of the belly slitter grew. Because when the coroners took Chloe's body away, they found that despite being stuffed with 50 pounds of stone and straw, the body was still somehow impossibly at a constant temperature of 98.6 degrees. She was empty, but she wasn't dead. She was just a doll, waiting for the next 12th night.